welcome. My guest is Representative John Kavanagh. He's from Legislative District 8, that's Scottsdale and Fountain Hills. He's also the House Appropriations Chair, and we're going to be talking about SB 1070. Representative Kavanagh, thank you for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the opponents of 1070, it's law now, it's not a bill anymore, they've come up with some ways that they think they're going to combat this in the courts. In some of the press conferences they've held, they've had attorneys talking about what they're going to do, and I wanted to bring you on because you have defended 1070 on those very issues that they brought up. And let's start with one of the ones that they keep talking about is that they're going to go out and get brown people off the street and question them.
Yeah, and that, of all the misinformation that's being spread about this bill, that is probably the most destructive. Because not only is it wrong, but it's unnecessarily scaring people. And it's probably one of the leading reasons behind this boycott, which is also not justified because this is a constitutional, reasonable law. These problems began early on when the campaign of misinformation was developed in an attempt to intimidate the governor into not signing the bill. She saw through the falsehoods, she signed the bill. They continued trying to put the pressure on nationwide. Now the misinformation is being used for this boycott, also unjustified. And they're basically saying that if you have brown skin, you can be stopped by a police officer in Arizona and questioned about your immigration status. Nothing could be further than the truth. Let me go through the legal steps that would be necessary before any police officer could stop and question somebody about their immigration status.
Now, to start with, of course, you're a former policeman from the East, so tell a little bit about that so people know where you're coming from.
Sure, yeah, and I'm a retired Port Authority Police Detective Sergeant, Port Authority, New York and New Jersey. Worked mostly in Manhattan, bus terminal area in Times Square. Did a lot of these street questionings. Also taught it in the police academy, so I'm quite familiar with this as a police procedure. And also I have a PhD in criminal justice, so I have a background in constitutional law. So I know, having helped write this law, that it is totally constitutional. So what would stop a police officer, other than ethics and decency, which our police have, from just walking up to some brown-skinned person and saying, "Show me your papers"? Well, let's go through the steps that this law requires before any inquiry about immigration status can occur. Number one, the individual has to have broken some other law. The only time police can go down this line of questioning about immigration status is with somebody who they have observed break another law. So right off the bat, you have a lawbreaker and not some person waiting for a bus to go to their job or somebody driving their kids to school. Even if the person broke the law, the questioning about immigration status is not allowed unless separate facts that the police officer observes or hears give the officer reasonable suspicion to believe that the person is in this country illegally. Now, that is a high bar to go over. It takes a lot of facts to get reasonable suspicion in something like that. So this is not going to be something which is occurring all the time.
Go through a scenario.
Okay, well, let's take, well, before I go beyond that, even the reasonable suspicion that they're here illegally, after they've broken another law, that will not result in an arrest of the person. An arrest could only be made if, in fact, the level of knowledge based upon the person's answers to questions or other facts rises to full-fledged probable cause that they're here illegally, which is the standard for arrest. So it's there are multiple high bars to jump over before anything's going to happen here. Typical scenario might be police officer observes somebody in a car violate the law, maybe blows through a stop sign, okay? Pulls the person over, says license or registration. Person says, I don't have my license with me. Officer says, why not? It was suspended. Oh, no problem, we can still check it. What's your name and date of birth? Officer gets that information, runs it in the police radio, comes back. No record of a driver's license ever being issued to a person with that name and date of birth. Officer goes back. Hey, we got a problem here. You said your license was suspended, but there's nobody with your name and date of birth ever had an Arizona driver's license. Oh, it was in Arizona. Oh, where was your license? Well, it was, Mexico, or any foreign country for that matter. Oh, so you have Mexican driver's license then. Well, how long have you been in this country? Oh, I've been in here, for 15 years. I went to high school here. Oh, really? Where? What city? Oh, so-and-so. What high school? And suddenly the answers to very simple questions become evasive, contradictory, or downright wrong. That's how a police officer slowly builds up reasonable suspicion that a person is committing a crime, in this case, illegal presence in the United States. And we will have every police officer in the state of Arizona, before this law takes effect at the end of July, will have taken a 2-hour course on what information in particular can help build reasonable suspicion of illegal presence, and just as important, what information cannot be used. And one of the pieces of information which cannot be used, which we put in the law, was the person's race, ethnicity, or nationality. That can only be used to the extent that it's permitted by the U.S. Constitution, the Arizona Constitution. So we specifically wrote multiple times in this law, you cannot racially profile.
I've noticed, I've read the law, probably one of the few that have, and what you've just said is in here often, that this can only be done according to and to the full extent of the U.S. Constitution and Arizona Constitution. In other words, it's repetitive. It's not just once or twice, it's several times in the law that regardless or notwithstanding or whatever kind of the legal language there is, that it has to abide by the federal law and Arizona Constitution.
If you support open government and transparency in the democratic process, then you've got to love this law. Because throughout the public hearing process, prior to passage, people came up to us with concerns. The civil rights community came up to us, and they were concerned about racial profiling. Based upon their concerns, we wrote in the law in multiple places that you can't use race, nationality, and ethnicity except as allowed by federal and state constitutions. We had police chiefs say, hey, we have a problem. You'll have cops tied up doing immigration checks when there's more serious crimes occurring. We said, good point. We wrote into the law, these checks only had to be performed when practical to do so. So if a cop were to be doing one of these checks and a bank robbery alarm goes off down the block, practicality says you stop the robbery. So, you let the person go, you go to the robbery. We had detectives.
The other part of that, may I interject, that was, I guess, obviously a lot of discussion talking about if you come across somebody who is a victim or a witness, and you don't worry about them because you're talking about somebody else, a more serious crime, whether that other crime being committed is by an illegal alien or not. So the potentiality of another person, a witness or a victim, you don't, according to what I've read and what's been described, you can't, in other words, you're really giving the police officer really no more authority, just more tools.
Yeah. Well, actually, there are two discretionary protections to shield witnesses to crimes and victims. Because early on, we had investigators say, hey, having to ask immigration status may very well scare victims and witnesses away. We have two protections. The first one is we said that if, in fact, asking this question would hinder an investigation, you don't have to ask the question. In addition...
And that's just good police work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to give cops discretion. You don't want to scare a witness or a victim away. But beyond that, remember, the only time a police officer is ever allowed to ask a person's about a person's legal status is not only when they reasonably suspect they're here illegally, but they have to have it originally pulled them over or cited them for some violation of law. Now, to the best of my knowledge, victims and witnesses don't break laws.